Welcome to Teaching to the Text, Textbooks or Technology. My name's Harley Richardson. I'm a member of the Institute of Ideas Education Forum. Textbooks or technology? So I'll be up front. I love technology. I'm particularly grateful to the person who invented word processors, which allow me to capture my rambling, unconnected thoughts, edit them, move them around until they look like something coherent and read from start to finish, and I can actually make sense of them. So I also love these things, books. The foundations of the building I live in are groaning under the weight of all the books that I've read or plan to read or will never get around to reading. So textbooks or technology, we could just say a bit of both and go home, but this is the battle of ideas, so we're going to try a bit harder than that and dig beneath the questions that behind this question. So I do have to declare an interest before I assume my neutral role as chair for this discussion. My day job is working for Discovery Education, which provides digital resources to schools in the UK, US and elsewhere in the world. Very proud of what we do, and through my job I get to meet a lot of people who are full of the possibilities of technology and trying lots of interesting things in the classroom with digital and other elements of tech. But just recently I was reminded that not everybody shares that enthusiasm. At Parents' Evening I went to a couple of weeks back, many of the parents were concerned that mobile phones were allowed in school because they worry that their children already spend too much time staring at screens and disconnected from the world. So I'm not sure that the argument for technology in the classroom has been won. So I'm very interested in that. And I'm also interested that there's been a resurgence of sorts in the last couple of years for traditional textbooks, certainly in the eyes of the Department of Education, which has promised to increase funding for textbooks. And that's despite them that they're having largely fallen out of fashion in the UK for a long while. So, which do we need most in a 21st century classroom? We have a great panel to help us explore this question. I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. So firstly, we have Tim Oates. Tim is the Group Director of Assessment Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment. And he can take some credit for the textbook revival because he's the author of an influential policy paper called Why Textbooks Count, which inspired this session. And also more recently, the Cambridge Approach, which is a set of principles for designing high quality textbooks and resource materials. Next we have José Picardo, the Assistant Principal of Suburbiton High School, and in his spare time a respected education blogger at Shooting Azimuths. José is also currently writing a book for Bloomsbury provisionally titled Using Technology in the Classroom. Here we have Colin Hughs, who's the Managing Director of Collins Learning and the Chair of the Education Publishers Council in the UK. He's had an impressive career in education and newspaper publishing, which includes founding Learn Things Limited, the Guardian's digital learning business. We have David Perks, the principal of the East London Science School, a free school which aims to give all pupils a rigorous academic education irrespective of their background or ability, which has technology at its heart. And when the school opened 3 years ago, every pupil was given a tablet to use in lessons. Dave can tell us whether or not they still have them. Finally, Susanna Goldschmidt, my colleague at Discovery Education. Susie is an experienced publisher of paper and digital resources for schools. In her current role as head of publishing, she is responsible for Discovery Education Espresso, which provides online resources for thousands of primary schools across the UK and Sweden. The speakers each have 5 minutes to make their introductory points. Then we're going to bring in the audience and hear what you have to say before going back to the panel. Over to Tim.
There may be a danger of an immediate outbreak of agreement on the panel, actually, but we'll try and be a little controversial. There are great and terrible textbooks in terms of traditional textbooks. There are great and terrible digital resources, and there's great and terrible pedagogy associated with both of those. And so that leaves us with some real issues about, well, what constitutes high quality material? What constitutes high quality pedagogy that's linked to those material? And I just want to spend my 5 minutes looking at that. It's interesting. If you become particularly interested in an aspect of the education system and drill down to it and try to understand it, if you're a researcher, you're often accused of being obsessed with that particular feature of the education system. But actually it's really right to do that. I mean, it's right that there are particular technicians that are really good at hydraulics. I quite enjoy that when I get onto an aeroplane. It doesn't mean I'm obsessed with it. It means that I'm really anxious to understand the role and the function traditional textbooks, understand what they've meant for hundreds of years in order to understand what we should do now. And it's of particular importance because control of textbooks, systematic control, and that doesn't mean necessarily control from the top, it can be controlled by the profession. Control of those materials has played a critical role in reform in certain countries, and that's really important. So the historical record tells us that high quality materials, designed well, managed well, with an associated pedagogy, have played a role in reform. And so the data that show that there's very low level of textbook use in this country, in contrast to places like Finland, Hong Kong, Singapore, is of interest. It's of interest. We need to understand it. And we need to understand why it's a problem, whether it's a problem, or whether it's an asset. And if it's a problem, what do we do about it? So the reason I became very interested in textbooks was that we looked at them and their history in intense detail because we understood, by looking at curriculum frameworks and reform, that they were a key instrument of curriculum enactment in a range of jurisdictions. Had a pivotal role as an instrument of enactment. So we decided to analyse the quality. We looked at over 400 textbooks, and we analysed them using publishers' own frameworks, a kind of information element analysis, to look at the functional elements. And that threw up something very important, that certain materials of high quality, associated with high quality pedagogy, and linked to historical periods of improvement in education systems, when those conditions are in place, there was also a key feature of these materials, that a set of fundamental educational ideas underpinned these materials and were promoted by them. Now, that argues that textbooks are textbooks, but they support a wide range of functions. I'll talk about those briefly. They certainly played a crucial role in Finland, this idea about ideas. When they transformed their system from a selective one to a comprehensive one, the way in which those ideas about comprehensive education were pushed through the system was fundamentally through well-organised materials. Now remember Reynolds and Farrell's work, Worlds Apart. It is still the case that their finding is true, that the best teachers around the world are those that are most supportive of high-quality textbooks. They seem a counterintuitive finding. And in Finland, textbooks still are seen as part of the, quotes, steering mechanism of education. 90% of lessons are structured using them. So this is a quote from Lucy Crehan's forthcoming book in December. In Finnish schools, the textbook is the main tool. Experienced and skillful teachers have come together, this is a Finnish teacher talking, with the publisher to create an interesting, enjoyable and motivating textbook that is based on the current curriculum. Nowadays, teachers have so many other things to do that planning the lessons, I would say all teachers depend on the materials a lot. I think this system is really typical for Finland and concerns the whole country. Of course, there are some exceptions, teachers who insist doing things on their own, and maybe not even using textbooks. But that's really rare. Who has the time? Now that's interesting. What's the worst thing that can happen in a primary school in England? Ofsted inspection? No. The photocopier breaking at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. Worksheets, for example, do not allow children to look at what they've done, because they just pass. They're a fleeting experience. Or what they are going to do. Textbooks provide a schema. They provide the shape of the subject. You can look backwards, you can look forwards. Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 pupils, who I show some of the latest, very well-designed textbooks to, say, have I got to learn all of that? That's what they all say. And of course the answer is yes. But they suddenly realise it for the first time. They have a schema for the discipline. That gives us a deep insight into what we're talking about with high-quality materials, whether they be paper-based or digital. They have to give children an idea of the shape of the subject, both its content and its networking in terms of where it explores the discipline. They need to be able to look back and look forward. Good digital materials allow people to do this. Bad digital materials have a test which disappears, which a child can never see or reflect on again. So this really means we need to think about principles. And those principles and the functions associated with those principles. And they apply to paper-based materials and to digital materials. What I'll finish on, thank you, is on digital. So I think it's great that Minister Nick Gibb has been extraordinarily engaged with the research on all of this and committed to both supply-side and demand-side reform in respect of textbooks. Let's just look at digital, because we need to understand that it performs differently. The latest cognitive and neuroscience applied to digital shows us that it's different. It has all sorts of affordances that paper don't have. But it's important that Singapore tried to implement digital materials which are an analogue of their paper-based materials and found it did not support the same functions of learning. So I'm very pro well-designed paper. I'm very pro well-designed digital. But I'm not in the same camp as Richard Coletta, who advised Obama to ditch all paper-based materials. I think that's phenomenally naive, because in doing that, you can actually also inadvertently ditch all of the principles that drive quality in both.
Thank you very much. Over to José.
I find myself in a peculiar position. I am speaking in a panel about textbooks or technology, and it turns out that I wholeheartedly disagree with the premise of the discussion, that it has to be textbooks or technology. Let me begin by painting a picture. I teach in a fairly forward-looking school where all teachers and students use, among other things, a tablet to help them teach and learn. Despite this appearance of 21st centuryness, at heart we are a school with very traditional values about what makes great teaching and learning. In my school, there would be outrage among our staff and our children if we were to tell them that they had to choose between textbooks or technology. Why? Well, because both are useful. Both facilitate learning in their own ways, as Tim was explaining earlier. So on their desks, students will refer to their tablets for some resources, to printed textbooks if they are being used for others, to exercise books, and sometimes even lever arch folders. They're all still there, alongside pens, pencils, pencil sharpeners, etc. It is not print or digital, nor it should be, we think. Whereas it can be very useful to debate opposing topics. The very word debate derives from the Latin for to battle the opposite. And so here we are having a battle of ideas. We must be careful not to frame the discussion in such a way that the resulting polarization makes its relevance increasingly moot. Does a textbook need to be in print form? Can it not be in digital form? Can it be accessible both digitally and in print? The answer is yes. Why don't we have those resources already available as both? What's stopping the publishers from doing this? Why can't we just print what we require for a particular topic of study in the knowledge that all the other topics can be easily accessed, downloaded and printed if necessary at any time, providing the scheme that Tim was referring to earlier? So when you listen to people's reasons as to why they say they prefer print over digital, these may range from they are easier to issue at the beginning of the year, what, really? Easier than tapping on a screen? Or they are easier to refer back to. Well, have they not heard of hyperlinking? That's how the internet works. You tap on links and you can refer back and forth to things. And some other people will say, in my languages department, they enjoy the smell of paper. So when you hear these reasons, you realize that digital resources are dismissed often for the wrong reasons by people who really don't understand or have a sufficiently good understanding, rather, of how these digital resources are actually used in practice. And yes, I know there are also studies and surveys that show that students prefer print. Well, leaving aside the fact that students, like all of us, prefer what they are used to, and that these preferences will change over time, we must remember as teachers that what students prefer may not always be what's best for them. So I remain fairly skeptical about this claim. The reason why I'm skeptical is because I know that practices that have been shown to improve teaching and learning, such as spacing study, interleaving topics, frequent low-stakes testing, often don't come naturally to learners. In fact, what learners prefer to do often goes against what cognitive psychology tells us is best for learning. And so it happens that well-designed digital resources can support these more successful pedagogical practices and others, such as pairing text with interactive graphics to aid conceptualization, featuring sound and video recordings, great for languages teaching and learning, or modeling solved problems to encourage metacognition. These things can be done much more easily and pedagogically more effectively in the digital form rather than a textbook. But there will be good and bad textbooks. There will be good and bad digital resources. Tim referred to this. In many respects, it's how these resources are used and in what context that matters. Proclaiming that one is inherently better than the other and that we must make the choice today is not helpful. And ultimately, won't contribute to the education that children receive. So let's not polarize. Let's agree that resources of any kind play a hugely important role in great teaching and learning, and focus instead on how we can make these resources better. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I first got involved in this about 17 years ago, launched a digital curriculum product for The Guardian called learn.co.uk, and I used to sit on platforms and speak to things called regional broadband authorities and so on, which we had in those days. Shame, but we did. I used to talk a lot about this, and I used to, in all sincerity, sit down or stand up and say, look, the logic here is that textbooks get replaced by digital, and it happens fast because it's so easy to do. Digital is so much more convenient. We can update, it's dynamic, it's connected, and so on and so on. And textbooks take a long time to create, and then they sit there for several years and they don't get replaced and revised. It's obvious that we're going to move to digital. Let's just get on with it. And I was so massively wrong. It's unbelievable. Many years later, actually, last year, I sat on a very similar panel to this at the International Publishers Association annual conference at the London Book Fair. And I was asked by the person chairing the panel, Colin, you set off doing this. Can you explain to me why is it that in the most recent surveys, only 14% of time in United Kingdom classrooms, and bear in mind we're a highly developed, highly connected society, why is it that only 14% use any kind of digital materials at all? Surely you failed. And my answer is maybe 14% is about right, actually. That might be the right level of use of digital materials in the classroom in the United Kingdom. It's worth bearing in mind, by the way, if we're just doing a quick little bit on stats here, that for the rest of the world it's about 4%. So there's still quite a lot of proselytization to do in terms of use of digital. What's good about digital? Well, quite a lot, actually. I mentioned some of the things, but it's also there are all sorts of other things we can do. There are areas to do with formative and indeed ultimately, I believe, summative assessment that will be much better done digitally. Adaptive learning platforms are going to be unbelievably useful. Actually, for me, the real value in digital at the moment is that you can simplify certain processes which are extremely helpful in taking workload off teachers or providing them with data and information that they would not otherwise be able to generate and understand what they're doing. So there's loads and loads of stuff that's really powerful about digital. It's not just a question of saying, let's make digital better at this or textbooks better at that. It's actually, I think, Jose and indeed Tim, it's about divining what that particular technology can do that the other one can't. And what I find from that is that textbooks are actually genuinely a better technology in certain ways. And there are many ways in which this is true. One of them, and I just want to pick up again on Jose talking about surveys. We actually survey at Collins. We're one of the largest revision providers in the UK. I very deliberately set about surveying every year students, 16-year-old students roughly, about their use of materials for revision, because it's extremely important to us to know what they use, how they use it, etc. And it is true, by the way, that actually consistently the use of print revision guides comes out way stronger. This is counter to everything that every educational technologist will tell you. If you meet people who do startups, edtech startups, they will tell you, look, all this is going to be replaced. Kids want to be online. Kids want to be using their mobiles. Kids want to be using tablets. You just need to go where they are. Actually, when you ask the kids, why do you prefer to use print? One of their reasons, there are many reasons, but part of it is to do with serendipity of being able to move around a textbook, which is actually a very good thing. But one of the reasons is I do my social life there, I do my entertainment there, I do all that kind of other, I watch films there, I connect with people there. I don't also want to do my classroom learning there. It's a very, very powerful thing, that, and I think we need to listen to what kids are saying about that. I want to flip back to something that Tim said about it being a key instrument. I think that's obviously I do think that textbooks are a key instrument in the process, and it's very important to remember that we who create textbooks are fundamentally not simply recreating content in a different order all the time. What we're doing is thinking several layers down, what's the best possible way of delivering learning, and then putting the content into that. But one of the reasons that textbooks fell out of fashion, as I think Harvey talked about right at the very outset in the UK, is that we developed this mad idea that it was an either-or between textbooks and not digital, but between textbooks and teachers. That was the problem. And teachers were told, actually they were told by Ofsted's forerunners, that if they used a textbook, that meant they were relying on a textbook, and it demonstrated that they didn't know enough about the subject themselves. Textbooks are not a substitute for quality teaching or indeed teacher knowledge. My view very strongly is that we need to get back to a situation where teachers understand what a textbook is, what its value is. I too commonly meet head teachers and deputy head teachers who actually don't know what a textbook looks like and don't have them in their schools. And that's happened to me quite frequently. We need to get back from that. We need to get back from that without having this dichotomous argument between textbook and digital. We need to focus very clearly on which one is good at which purpose.
Thank you very much. Dave, what would you like to say?
So in terms of my understanding of textbooks, so if you come into my office, there's a bookshelf and I have a collection of old physics textbooks that go back many, many years. They are gold dust to me, and they are a source of reference both to me personally but to any child that wishes to have them, and teacher. And my thing about the sort of recent period is that there are no textbooks being produced of that calibre, and there haven't been for a long time. Now, I know Nick Gibb and Tim are working hard to change that around, and putting pressure on publishers to sort of buy into that. But I still think we're in a position where the old idea of what a textbook was, as a reference for your subject, has all but disappeared. And I am talking about particular things, but if you're in the game of physics teaching like I was, I just say Muncaster and you know exactly what I mean. There are plenty of other ones that people know because they are like a Bible source, a reference, which you can use with pupils and yourself, and that's something that we've lost. It's literally not there. I do take your point that you were saying in terms of there was a real push to get rid of textbooks out of the classroom, but I actually think that was because of the quality of the textbooks was getting worse and worse and worse, and therefore that you had people buying in schemes, especially at something like Key Stage 3, when the SATs still existed, which became more and more driven by the outcome that you're trying to generate, less and less about teaching the subject, and so they actually became useless. And I think that is still the case, that too many textbooks are driven by exam boards who in some cases own the publisher and therefore are reproducing themselves in another form. They're not about educating the pupils in terms of the subject that you're looking at. So just to step back just a tiny bit. So if textbooks are the answer, what is the question, right? So you could say poor teacher knowledge. There's too much content, we can't do it. Primary schools, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 2 curriculum has been introduced, and they're screaming at us that they can't deliver it. They've got no one there who knows what to do. You could say, well, the exams are all changing, we desperately need a textbook to teach that exam, or else we can't do it. Without that resource, what are we supposed to do? Yeah, but if you go back far enough, none of those questions were relevant, because the teaching profession used to do this by itself, didn't need to talk to publishers about textbooks, didn't need to talk to exam boards about the difficulty they've got with a new change in the syllabus. They would just be expected to just get up and sort it out. But there's been a collapse completely across the board in terms of the professionalism of the teaching profession to deal with what is their bread and butter, teaching their subject in the classroom, regardless of the exam board syllabus or whatever else has been changing. So we've narrowed down and narrowed down and narrowed down, and therefore we're now saying that textbooks are going to solve all these problems, or at least an attempt to do that. And the answer is, they can't. Okay? So these are other problems that textbooks will not be able to address. So then what does a good textbook look like? If I'm getting too long, you have to remind me.
Okay.
Right, so if I'd look at it, then you've got to have a clear focus on your subject. You've got to be challenged completely to deal with your subject. You've got to have a rack of questions that are going to test you out and not be easy to answer. And you've got to be able to go beyond the level that you're supposed to aim at. And if you can't go beyond it, then you're not leading someone anywhere, you're closing them off. And that's the same in many other aspects of education. And I think that's patently not the case in the way textbooks are designed. Textbooks are designed to simplify, to break things up, to make them aim at below average students, to ensure that the success is guaranteed in a lesson. It's a double page spread or whatever, and you sit there and you do it and that's it, signed off. So these are all ones which we are lowering our expectation of what we're getting out of education and what we're getting out of textbooks. Right, so what does a good textbook look like? Right, this is mine, yeah, this one. Now nobody in here, I'm sure, will even want to read this or will have read it. I'll show you, right? This is a book about the C programming language, which is, for anybody who knows about programming will know that this is the core of modern programming. It is so fundamental that you won't understand it unless you get your head stuck in it and try and work it out. Written by the two guys who wrote the language. And this was not designed to be put into a school, probably not even into a college. This is designed to go into the hands of industry guys to say, well, this is the language we've written, do what you will with it, right? And they did. They wrote Windows with it. The early version of Windows was based on this, and everything you know about computer programming and everything like that is out of this. That, if you are an individual and pick that up, you can learn that language if you're so dedicated to do it yourself, or you can use it as a guide, you know, within a different context. It's actually really, really thin, but incredibly dense, and there are no pictures whatsoever. And if I read a sentence out of it, if the type of an expression or sub-expression is, inverted commas, array of T, for some type T, then the value of the expression is a pointer. And I could go on. So to me, that is taking you seriously. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, I want this in every school in the country or something like that. But what I will say is that approach is the approach where you get a good textbook, you know you're going to go back to it, because every sentence in it is a challenge to you to understand, and a conversation you have with that textbook for years, not 20 minutes in a lesson. And I think there's a completely different relationship. Digital, just really, really quickly, because so I think if you think you can get that, what I've just explained from digital, I think you're wrong, right? You can't. This book was written, don't even remember, a long, long time ago in the 80s, right? I still use it. No website can do that. They weren't invented then, so it can't be, right? But they don't last. Their content is ephemeral. they're not written in the same way, and the relationship you have with the textbook is a completely different thing to a website. I'm not saying you can't get stuff out of websites, you can, but I don't see it in that way. I think the whole premise in which digital has been designed is ephemeral and is not long-standing, and therefore we've got a problem in the way which we design things, and that's kind of like a very simple way of saying a more complicated thing.
Okay, thanks. And how are the iPads, the tablets doing in your school, if you don't mind me asking?
They're mostly broken. We've given up tablets for the time being. They don't mix with children, I'm afraid. But that's a practical thing, and if you want to challenge me on that, you can.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Over to you, Susie.
So I think that comparing textbooks with technology is a bit like comparing a teleological treatise with an encyclopedia. One of them serves, and I think here I differ slightly with Dave, one of them serves a practical purpose, to set out the knowledge and skills that lead to a particular level or a fixed endpoint, whether there be an exam at stake or not. So it could be setting out the knowledge that you require for Key Stage 3 or the knowledge that you need to pass a GCSE. Whereas the other offers the possibility of an unfettered journey through knowledge, guided perhaps by external direction or maybe even just by your own interest and inclination. For me, it's precisely the fact that technology does not, and cannot, if we agree with the research that Tim referred to about cognitive and neuroscientific ways of learning, they cannot provide an effective schema of subject knowledge that makes technology such a powerful tool in education. Where it's the nature and role of textbooks to be selective and prescriptive, how else could they make clear to teachers and students what the requirements for a particular level are? Digital packages, freed from the constraints of page extents and consistently structured units, can be expansive. The prevailing political climate in education in England is libertarian. Michael Gove's legacy is a curriculum which explicitly leaves space for interpretation, creativity, and choice. In these circumstances, a textbook which pins down the required learning or defines a particular scope and sequence almost seems something of an anachronism to me. How could a textbook ever cater for the plurality of options that now face subject teachers, especially at secondary level? Digital media, on the other hand, lend themselves brilliantly to expanding horizons and showing the vistas of knowledge that lie between the lines of the written syllabus. Videos can take learners beyond their own lives and show them the applications of what they're studying in real contexts and at more advanced levels. Digital activities encourage students to engage actively in what they're learning, particularly if they simulate experiments or pose complex challenges for students to solve. The humble hyperlink makes explicit how topic A relates to topic K. And virtual reality can transport students into entirely different contexts for varied learning experiences. And quite aside from the debate about knowledge for practical purposes versus knowledge for the sake of knowledge, on a pragmatic level, as Colin mentioned, technology offers tools capable of liberating teachers from drudge work and allowing them to focus on the real business of teaching. Auto-marking is powerful precisely because it saves teacher time in an area in which, in the case of right or wrong questions at least, the teacher's input isn't really necessary. Digital data collection provides teachers, schools and administrators with results breakdowns and overviews that can save them hours or even days of analysis. On the other side of the coin, some types of knowledge lend themselves particularly well to being learnt digitally. My background is in language learning, and I remember that some of the best resources I used over the course of my degree, or indeed whilst I was still at school, were technology driven. They were simple tools that allowed me to digest and learn a lot of vocabulary and practice it over and over again. Something that I could have done that on paper, but it would have taken me reams of note writing to do. Publishers like the one I work for have created hybrids, digital textbooks, ours are called tech books, that combine the substance of textbooks with the attributes of digital. The result is a rich tapestry of text interwoven with digital media. Links within units take students to virtual labs where they can explore phenomena, or to interactive glossary entries where definitions are illustrated with videos and animations. These textbooks are structured by the topics covered on the curriculum, but they use them as jumping-off points to guide students to much broader and richer knowledge. And so, whilst the years I spent editing and publishing textbooks have convinced me of the important practical role they play in the classroom in making clear what the requirements are to reach a particular standard, and in setting out that content in a clear and coherent manner, I remain convinced that there's space for both textbooks and technology in the modern classroom, like José is. And though I know it's become something of a cliche now for those in favour of digital resources and 21st century skills to point out how closely today's classrooms and teaching instruments resemble those of the 1900s, whereas our workplaces have changed beyond recognition, I nonetheless think it's relevant to consider the role that schools play in preparing students for working life. When was the last time you sat down in your office to write with a pen and paper? So let's not be reductionist in our assessment of what students are at school to do. School's not just about learning what the curriculum stipulates should be learnt, it's also about expanding horizons, transformative experiences, developing one's own interests, and even gaining some gentle preparation for working life. So, like several of the panellists so far, I'd like to say in answer to the question, textbooks or technology, resoundingly both.
Thank you very much. Tim was talking very much about text, that one of the advantages of this is it gives you a sense of the shape of a subject and sort of what you've got to get to grips with. Susie just talked about an unfettered journey through knowledge. And in schools in the last few sort of decade, we've had a lot of people arguing for cross-curricular learning, so breaking down boundaries between subjects and so on. And as Tim hasn't spoken for a little while, I just thought before we go out to the audience, just see if you've got any reflections on that.
Okay, well, the good news is I disagree fundamentally with that notion that rich, expansive experiences in education can be optimum for children. They can be extremely helpful, but at certain stages in understanding, they are not optimal at all. And the reason is this. The very best teachers remember what it's like to not know something. The worst teachers can no longer remember what it's like not to understand the thing that they're trying to explain. So if you present children with a multifaceted, rich, expansive expression or a presentation of a particular problem, where they're supposed to learn a very specific thing, such as what a metaphor is, or the nature of the polarity on a particular particle, then to present that in a context which is highly expansive and rich can be completely counterproductive. And we know that from extensive empirical work, that you need to know what you're looking for in reality. And very often children do not. Some of the best work on science practicals, as David knows well, when you interview the kids after the practical, they've got from it things that you didn't expect at all, and they've not got an understanding of the central idea for which the practical was originally devised. So I think these kind of insights from the psychology of perception, the psychology of learning, are fundamental, and you can get it very badly wrong in the design of digital materials.
I was just interested that the one thing I don't think has been mentioned so far was, I suppose, the idea of flipped classrooms. Some of the most positive things that I've seen are our maths teachers or our science teachers going through the theory on videos so that when the pupils come into class they're getting real quality instruction and help with their problem solving rather than spending their time in the classroom watching things that could have been done at home the night before.
Just a couple of questions really. One is there a danger that this discussion becomes a cipher for our philosophy of education? I mean, are we having a discussion over our ultimate sort of view of what education ought to be through the prism of technology, and could that be potentially confusing for us? Is there a prior argument we need to have first? And then one of the other things I was interested in is how do we conceive this as varying by subjects? I mean, we don't just teach in general, and different subjects have a different conceptual structure. So maths, physics, English, art, quite different. So how would we see this as varying by the subject of instruction?
I just want to build on what Tim Oates was saying, that I really don't think technology is in opposition to the textbook. What is in opposition is the kind of creative curriculum idea, cross-curricular, child-centered learning, personalised learning, and the kind of thing I hear in my school is that that's just not relevant for our children. We need to do everything from scratch for this group of children, and we have a topic, and then the outcome is something like a fair trade breakfast. We have to have a social justice outcome, and every lesson has to be linked to the social justice outcome and the rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the rights respecting agenda. So the idea of technology versus textbook is not the opposition in my experience.
Just to declare an interest, I've been 40 years in textbook publishing of one kind or another. I'll just make 2 points. One is hardly anybody, well, Dave nearly mentioned the word author, but no one really seemed to say anything at all about how this content is produced. It's like this sort of homogenized industrial process that produces this content. I would suggest that one of the reasons behind what Dave's describing, perhaps a little too brutally for my taste, but I know what he means, is that the role of the author has diminished, and there's this idea, both driven by government and by the commercial end of things, in a rather unpleasant tandem, which suggests that this content is just two a penny, and really you can just throw it together and it's all be fine, and as long as it complies with sort of various outcomes that are desired. The second point I'd like to make is about Tim's slightly spooky use of the word control. Let's just be careful here. We live in a country which is quite unusual, not unique, but quite unusual in that we leave it up to, generally speaking, the heads of departments and the teachers in the schools to decide what materials that they like to use. The only exception to that, as I understand it at the moment, is to do with superphonic teaching at primary school. Okay, so go to the Texas state adoption system, where, you know, the science panel reviewing science textbooks, out of, I think, the 13 people on that panel, 12 are creationists. Just beware of what you wish for.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, the word control is very problematic, and I use it very carefully. I mean it in Bill Schmidt's sense of the importance of making sure that different elements in the system align. And that alignment needs to be effected through curriculum control. And that may or may not be done directly from the top, from the state. I've been absolutely astonished at sitting in rooms with Colin over the last 2 years, discussing the quality and the absence of quality previously in textbooks in this country, and the rise of the very dysfunctional instrumentalism which Dave actually outlined extremely clearly. What I've been amazed by and incredibly impressed by, and I don't mean this in a patronising way, is the extent to which publishers have said, yes, the situation in England has given rise to this poor quality for a whole series of reasons, and we're going to take it by the scruff of the neck and grapple with it, and they have done. The quality of the most recent batch, the most recent generation of textbooks which has been coming out of Collins, Hodder, CUP, OUP, they're amazing, and they've been created by the publishers, as it were, self-regulating quality. It is about control. It's about very carefully aligning the textbooks with a pedagogic model and with specific understandings of content. It's been supported by the state, but not operated by the state. So I think the word control is problematic, but I don't think it's spooky. It talks to this idea of curriculum alignment.
Okay, Dave was desperate to come in as well, so I think we will go with the panel. Dave?
Oh, there's tons of things on the table now to talk about. I think Toby's sort of point about the prior argument, I think is really, really important. It's, if you come at textbooks or digital media with the idea that you're trying to move away from subject-based education, then the result is going to be obviously different than if you focused on subject-based education. And I think the thing is that digital, unfortunately, makes it much easier to break the idea of subject-based education by claiming that you can open things up, and therefore the natural response is to do that. I think that's a mistake. I think you can't actually achieve what you're trying to do if you do that. And what you end up doing is then, in the worst examples, is you end up with people coming to you from a publisher, digital publisher, saying, I've not only given you some resources, but I'm telling you how to teach as well. And that has happened time and time again, where you get someone coming, well, here's your scheme, we've done all your lesson plans, we've done all this, we're focusing on these areas of the national curriculum or wherever else it is, because we think these are really important. Excuse me, you know, there's alignment that goes a bit wrong. So I think there's a debate there that needs to be had more broadly about what we mean by education, and therefore in that context then work with it. And that's what Tim's trying to talk about. He's been doing with publishers, but I don't think that's universally the case. And a couple of other little bits on this. The sort of author point that Philip raised, I think is really, really important, because what actually you do when you engage with a textbook, a substantial textbook, is you engage with that author's view of the subject. And that is only one person's view of it, it is true. But it is really important that you do that, because then you're getting a coherent and consistent view that can be argued with. Whereas if it's mandated, by committee that this is the knowledge that you should learn, and it's truncated and it is not taken anywhere, there's a cap put on it, you've got nothing to argue with. That textbook is not going to work. It's just going to be deliver and then chuck it away. And I think there's a complete difference between the two things. So I think Philip's really, really right that we've gone away from the idea that there were people who used to write textbooks because they meant it. And now we're sort of trying to craft these things out of committee, and I worry about that.
Colin, yes.
Yeah, just very. I mean, Philip is of course right about that. But the single biggest problem with the quality of textbooks is actually that we have to produce textbooks that deliver to exam boards. When you go and talk to teachers about textbooks, they have no idea that our textbooks, your textbooks, as were Philip, and indeed I'm sure your content, Susie, is almost entirely written by very high quality teachers who are extremely experienced in their subject. Always have been, and absolutely emphatically are today. And many teachers are still shocked when you explain that to them, how it actually happens. And they ask, why isn't it more individual? And the answer is very straightforward, is that we are absolutely obliged to deliver a particular system. But most importantly, at the higher levels, we're absolutely required to do things according to the way exam boards want them done. So in some sense, the teachers are actually experiencing this correctly. Their judgment is that we create textbooks in cahoots with exam boards. Well, we're obliged to, because actually they won't buy them otherwise. If we do what you want to do, Dave, which teachers won't. If we do what you want to do, which I would love to do, which is to be expansive and expressive about the subject, I can assure you that the overwhelming majority of teachers will not buy those textbooks. What they want and what they are required to get is textbooks that deliver precisely, and this is the crucial bit, and only what the exam boards want them to. You don't get the textbook endorsed otherwise. The single best thing we could do, and we are going to get controversial now, the single best thing we could do to improve the quality of textbooks from the point which we have now arrived at, that Tim covered earlier, the single best thing we could do is get exam boards out of the business of textbooks. Right. Totally out of it. Not only through ownership, but through endorsement and the entire process. There should be complete separation between, and actually, by the way, Singapore, for example, does have a total separation between the two. Absolutely critical. What we must not do, and again, being controversial slightly on the control question, by the way, Tim, I do understand your differentiation about what your use of the word there. But I am nervous, along the lines that Philip is nervous, that actually, by the way, Philip, we are just about to have a second arena of the curriculum that is about to be controlled in the way that you meant, which is the teaching of mastery maths at primary school, that textbooks that are not subject to panel agreement, a panel chosen by politicians, will not actually receive funding for purchase in primary schools, exactly the same way that phonics worked. This is just the door opening to state control of resources in schools, and I think we should be anxious about it. I am not flatly opposed at the moment, but I am actually genuinely quite concerned about where this may ultimately lead to. The degree of control is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Very quickly to your point, technology, books vary by subject massively. Absolutely, totally agree with that.
Okay, thanks. So we need to sort of church and state separations, sounds like that, of exam boards over there. José?
Yes, so I'd like to come back on a couple of things that the audience has picked up, and also some of the things that the panel have mentioned as well. I too agree that different subjects will use different resources in different ways. I think we have to remember that textbooks and digital resources don't exist in isolation of the curriculum or the teachers, the subjects. Having discussions like this can risk being very prescriptive and making proclamations about what's best. In fact, I believe in something called professional judgment, and I would encourage every teacher to apply professional judgment when it comes to using textbooks or any other kind of resource. There's also the mention of flipped learning earlier. A gentleman over there mentioned flipped learning. I think this is another discussion that can be polarized very, very quickly. Flipped learning is better than ordinary learning, and so on.
Just explain what's flipped learning.
Yes, indeed. Flipped learning is. I think the gentleman did a good job of explaining what it was earlier. Is when you it used to be called setting prep before, when you used to set the homework before you taught a topic. This is something not new. It's not something that that's been brought with digital technology. This used to happen when I was at school, before I ever knew what a mobile phone was. So these things have always happened. The purpose of flipped learning is that you teach, you perhaps show a video to the children, or point the children to a video that explains the topic. So when you go to the lesson, you can actually deal with that topic and any problems that the children may encounter in understanding that topic. The teacher is actually there to help the children. Whereas if you do it the other way around, if you explain the topic in a lesson and then set some homework, and the children then struggle with that, the teacher is not there to help them. So it makes sense. In some cases, and I have to say in some cases, I apply my professional judgment, and when I'm teaching the subjunctive in the sixth form, I know that it's a topic, so I very often will set them prep, flipped learning, in advance of the lesson, so when they come to the lesson, they at least have a working knowledge of that there is something called the subjunctive, and an idea of what it does. So that's flipped learning. So anyway, the point I was going to make is that we can risk polarizing the debate with flipped learning and ordinary learning, and I think any teacher would be best served by using flipped learning when it's best for a particular topic, or in your experience, when has it worked, when hasn't it worked? We can't really make the claim that it always works better than. So that's the point I was making about flipped learning. When it comes to authors, I agree with everything that's been said about authors, but I'd like to throw in something to the debate, and I would like to say, can teachers, who hopefully are experts in their subject, can they not become authors of their own resources as well? Can digital resources be authored mainly by somebody who has published the resource, but can that resource then not be enhanced, augmented, added to by the teacher? That's much easier done if you use digital resources. Now, going to the panel, I'll be very brief. Going back to the panel, I think we're dismissing digital technologies because it's expensive and so on. I think when people have sold digital technology in the past, they've made very, very wild claims about how wonderful and how education is going to be revolutionized by things. And I think that we can't measure technology or its success in teaching and learning according to these wild claims. We have to actually measure technology according to how it works in practice. And I think we often compare, we look at technology and say, well, actually, their claim was that it was going to revolutionize everything, therefore technology doesn't work. So actually, no, that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is, well, it actually doesn't do that, but what does it do? So I like to challenge the fact that technology has to be expansive or has to be in a particular used in a particular way. It's how you use technology that matters. You can create digital resources that are very subject specific and follow a textbook format, if that's what you really want to do. So it's how you use it. Finally, one of the throwaway comments that I think David made earlier about teaching tablets and children don't mix. So I like to pick him up on that, because I know he was trying to be controversial. Maybe not, I don't know. But I work in a school where all children use a tablet, as I said earlier, and I think we're doing a good job of teaching and learning with tablets. I know many other schools who are doing a good job, and I also know schools where tablets haven't worked well. So I think rather than saying children and tablets don't mix, I think what we need to do is actually look inwards a little bit and say, what are we doing that is causing me to think that children and tablets don't work, where it clearly works elsewhere? Maybe that is the wrong premise to begin with.
Okay, Dave, there's something to come back to. Susie, though, anything you'd like to pick up on?
Yeah, well, one question that seems to be underlying a lot of the debate is this debate a cipher for a question around the philosophy of education. I think actually at the heart of this debate, and I think there are slight differences on the panel, there's the question of what is a textbook for? Because I think, Dave, you dismissed recent textbooks from the kind of the last generation of textbooks as being kind of outcome driven, but Colin, you've said something which is very consistent with my own experience, namely that teachers actually want them to be outcome driven. At the moment, they're asking publishers to produce textbooks that make explicit what the curriculum asks for. And Tim, in Why Textbooks Count, you also talk about how textbooks are kind of one of a bag of ingredients, one of the instruments that governments have for creating curriculum coherence if publishers can make explicit what is stated in a few lines in the curriculum. So on the one hand, there's that view, the view of a textbook as a kind of delimited resource that makes explicit what the knowledge expected for a particular level is. And on the other hand, we have a view of the textbook as something that is very expansive, that is perhaps somebody's own vision of the schema of a subject, and that may take you way beyond what's stated as the requirements of the curriculum. And I think obviously it's the case that different types of textbook exist and should exist, and there's a role for all of them. So to your point, Jose, does technology have to be expansive? I completely agree. Obviously, it doesn't have to be expansive, but it can offer a nice counterpoint if we are currently in a culture in which most of our textbooks are limited in their content and are outcome driven. Then technology can offer us a way of expanding beyond the textbook, if I can put it that way.
This is a question about policy, not technology. Really, is what we do with the technology.
Agreed. Yes. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
This is primarily directed at Tim, but I'd be interested in what the others think. So we've had a long trend now of academics say something sensible, and then head teachers go and completely misunderstand that, sort of take the headline and then just push that line. And I mean, I'm a great believer in textbooks, but what I wouldn't want to see happen is what could well happen is that a load of heads now go away and say, you know what, textbooks is the answer. All this technology, we don't have to spend all that money. Let's just spend it on books. Let's get those books in. Let's have everyone have their textbooks open in the lesson. And, I mean, we do remember, right, there were valid reasons why Ofsted had a problem with textbooks, because those lessons tended to become deathly boring if the philosophy of education wasn't right. So I think it is about philosophy of education. And whilst I'm a great admirer of Tim's work, and I think his work on textbooks is extremely valuable if it defends knowledge. Textbooks as a defense of subject knowledge is great. If it becomes, which I fear it will, the next flipping fad on how to teach, then it's a problem.
Hi, thank you. I think just touched upon then, I'm a primary school teacher and we use both digital and textbooks, but we've just brought in textbooks for grammar. And I was observing some of my colleagues the other day, and there were very, very different lessons coming out of exactly the same textbook. So I think it goes on to that knowledge of education and the professionalism of the teacher themselves, of how you have the best textbook available in the market, but it's how it's used in that classroom to whether it's going to be a good learning tool. So maybe it could be a discussion on, it's actually retraining on teachers how to use these resources as the next step, because there are some great ones out there, but they're being used very, very differently in the classrooms.
I kind of agree with what you're saying. Teachers need to know how to use them, but I think there's a prior thing, which is teachers actually need to know what their knowledge is first, and actually what their knowledge involves. And I'll just give you a very quick example from my own experience teaching at secondary level, an English teacher. So my task was to get this group of students to the obligatory C pass in their GCSEs, and they were using the school had brought in this latest technological software digital package on literacy, and they were awfully engaged. I mean, they were really motivated. I sort of walked in and they were all sat there, all tapping away and getting very enthusiastic about all the very high scores they were getting on their grammar and spelling and what have you. So I thought, well, this is a bit odd. It doesn't seem like I've got much of a job here to do. And I said, well, let me have a look at your work. Bring your coursework out. Let's have a look at it. It was absolutely blooming awful. And I said, what is going on here? Why, you're getting 18 out of 20 on this level 3 on literacy, something or another here, and yet, you know, your work is absolute rubbish. So what's going on? And they said, well, you know, I said, well, we know we can spell, we know how to use that bit of grammar, so why do we have to do it again and again? Which alerted me to a problem of a really different sort. The problem wasn't sort of one of that kind of immediate, empirically observable propositional knowledge. It was a deeper problem, that this group of students in their educational life had not really been introduced to the idea that writing was actually a very potent, powerful and transformative way of expressing their own inner ideas, you know, and by doing it properly they can improve it, they can talk to the teacher about it, and really kind of use it in a way they had never really thought before, which was, you know, unfortunately, as we know, very instrumentally, like you want to do well in literacy to get a job and all the rest of it. And then then secondly, following on from that, I thought what this group of students do not need is either another textbook with more grammar and literacy or another software package with grammar and literacy. What they actually needed was poetry and creative writing, so that they could get a sense of their own subjectivity being able to be made objective through good writing.
A couple of points. I really agreed with Dave's point about, and I think it's been accepted by the panel, the quality of textbooks in recent years has been shocking. When I became a history teacher, I was astonished by the sort of the lack of content really in the books that I was expected to use. Just loads of pictures, awful questions, quite often 3 for a lesson that kids could do in 5 minutes. You were just compelled to go away and do extra stuff. You just couldn't, they were unusable. And I know it's different depending on which subject you're teaching, but in the history area, I also looked at some of the old books I'd still kept from years ago, and the difference was amazing. The content level, what was expected, it was really astonishing. And I think it's not been picked up on, but it was a disgrace, really, that the books were so poor and what we were expecting of students was so limited in the content of the textbooks. I think there's an interesting question that's been raised about whether we even need textbooks at certain levels. I hadn't really contemplated that as a thought, one of the interesting things. Again, that made me think about my own A-level history experience. Well, we didn't use a textbook, we used original authors' books. Alan Bullock, book Portrait of Tyranny, I think it's called, I can't remember exactly, was something that sticks in my mind still as an original adult book about the rise of Hitler. Do we need a textbook at certain levels? I'm not sure. The final point I'd like to make is about technology. I think it is a bit early to say what the potential of technology. I love reading books, but here's my Kindle, right? And I think it's a fantastic bit of kit. I've got 100 books on here, at least, probably more now. I can index pages, I can look up words, and in relation to education, I think it's the case that people talk about, I can remember one of the guys talked about the possibility of good quality, updatable books. It doesn't seem to be that they're actually produced yet. I teach politics. That always needs updating. And it seems to me that publishers actually have got a bit of an issue in working out how to monetize kind of digital resources, which could be really flexible in areas like politics, could be continually updated on the device like this. Could be fantastic. I just don't think we're there yet. So I think it's too early to tell whether technology could really be brilliant in the way that some people have expected.
Thank you very much.
I think you slightly fell prey. Michael Barber has that wonderful expression, the false dichotomies of education. And I think some of the discussion here has highlighted that, because I don't think it is either or. I think it must be both. But you've touched really well on this issue of quality. When I worked for 20 years in financial public relations, I now teach year 5 in primary school. When I sat the teacher's test to see if my subject knowledge was good enough, I was surprised that there were mistakes in those papers, Pearson. And then when I started using textbooks, I was surprised how poor quality they were. And then when I started to explore the TES website, I was appalled at the quality of some of the materials that teachers themselves produce. So for me, it all comes back to quality rather than an either or.
Yeah, so I just did my A-levels a couple of years ago, and for my history AS, the subject that we covered was post-war Germany, like till the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the exam board didn't produce a textbook because there weren't enough of us that, like, it wasn't worth their time to produce a textbook for us. And I was quite lucky because I found the subject really interesting, and I enjoyed reading more widely and finding resources for myself online. But I know a lot of people that history wasn't what they wanted to go into in that particular subject. They found it too difficult to go out and actually look for things by themselves. So I think, on the one hand, it is better. It's really important to have wider engaging materials that help you to engage with the subject better. But you do have to think about people that actually they're just doing it because they have to pass. They're doing it because they won't be able to do. I know medics that did history A level, and they did need that textbook. They needed that kind of guidance. So I think what would be the way to bridge the gap between making sure that people are engaged and reading further, and also being able to pass their exams.
Colin, you look like you want to go first.
There's loads I'd like to come back on. There are three things I want to pick on particularly. One, errors. There are mistakes in the curriculum. I know it astonishes people that this is possible, but it's absolutely the case. I publish books that I know have incorrect grammar teaching in them, because I have to do that, because that's what the curriculum says. And if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, it's the only area where I actually proof our stuff, because I don't have the time to do it normally. And I am absolutely appalled by the primary grammar curriculum. It's shocking. On the question of monetizable dynamic content, which I think is a really interesting subject, actually, and it's very interesting to us, I really, really would like to be able to do that, but it's extremely difficult to do it in a way that we can actually do it economically. And the point about teacher-created content on things like the TES, it's not just that it's often not very good or it's wrong and it's risky to rely on. It's also going to Tim's really important work on the fact that you are creating a system. It's completely unsystematized. It's got no consistent pedagogy behind it at all, and that is a real risk. But I also just want to talk about and just sort of take you to task a little bit on the Kindle thing. It's not really taking you to task, but to make a point. I work for a publisher that also is one of the world's largest publishers of novels and non-fiction trade publishing. And when I started working for HarperCollins 4.5 years ago, there was a massive, steep upward trajectory of the purchasing of novels for Kindle. In women's fiction, actually, for us, we were the largest proportionally. It actually went to 52% with women's commercial fiction at one particular point. This was about 2.5 years back. Actually, there is either a plateauing, or indeed it looks at the moment as if there is a very gentle decline in the purchasing of ebooks. And I think there's a really good reason for that. And actually, there's quite a lot of research on this, that the experience of screen, reading and consumption is fundamentally different from the experience of the reading of print. And that was why I made that very quick throwaway comment in my opening remarks. Books are a different and excellent technology. And actually, it's not just book obsessives like me who like sniffing the spines of books because we're weird. It's actually people generally find that books are an amazingly gorgeous way to consume stuff in lots of different contexts, on tube trains, on buses, lying on beaches, whatever the context may be, or sitting at home revising for their A-levels. They just happen to work in certain contexts, and Kindles work in other contexts. And it's just not surprising. The users work it out very quickly for themselves, what works and what doesn't work. So that would be my main argument on that.
Jose wanted to go next.
There's a few things. The lady up there said that the teacher needs to know the stuff, essentially, for lessons. I mean, we can all agree with that. It's absolutely essential. Teacher knowledge is paramount in the quality of instruction. But I think there's more to this than just teacher knowledge. I think there's more layers. I think a teacher only needs to know the stuff. The subject knowledge is obviously very important. But it's also very important that the teacher is aware of how to teach the stuff is the pedagogical content knowledge. So not only do you need to know your subject, but you need to know what are the best ways to teach or learn. You need to be familiar with this. And there's another layer to this, I think, these days, is that teachers need to be able to discern as to what is the best resource to use for a particular time. And sometimes this resource is going to be a paper book. Sometimes this resource is going to be electronic. And I think it's paramount that teachers are able to understand when one resource works better than the other. Because if they don't, and they just say things like, a paper is always best, then you're not doing your job properly. You, as a teacher, it's your responsibility to know what works when and in what context. So that's part of good teaching, I think. Going back to the quality of teaching that the gentleman over here also mentioned. I'd like to touch upon publishers. I think publishers are terrified of making resources available online because people can just download them and they don't get any money, so any profits from it. So that's really the main reason. I mean, let's be honest. That's really the main reason why there aren't so many digital textbooks out there. I think what they have done so far is they have produced PDFs that are available under key and lock on the internet, and then you have to scroll around to find stuff. That's not, and then they say, well, actually, teachers really prefer actual paper textbooks. Yes, that's right, because the resources that are available online are rubbish, so that's another question. One more thing, engagement. Actually, two more things, but I'll be very, very quick. Engagement is was mentioned earlier. I would argue that engagement is a poor proxy for learning. So we really need to look at other ways to look at. Finally, Kindles. I promise. Promise is the last thing. Kindles are fantastic, and just to agree with Colin here, that when Kindles were introduced and the e-books were introduced, well, this is going to be the future of reading. Well, it isn't, is it? It's just another option. And it works well in some contexts, and it works better in others. When I go on holiday, I'd much rather take my Kindle than 5 books. So everything has a time and a place.
Okay, thanks. Tim?
Okay, so many things to say, but I'll focus really on, I think, 2 points. The point about implementation, thank you very much indeed. I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to really refer Chris Hadfield, Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. He's got a book in there called "You Need to Sweating the Small Stuff." We're told not to sweat the small stuff. You have to. We're talking really in respect of pedagogy today. It's not a cipher for talking about philosophy of education. We are talking about the philosophy of education. We are talking about underpinning learning models. If the underpinning learning models, the assumptions about ability, the sequencing of instruction, the content of the discipline is not considered in the development of an individual piece of material, whether it's a, frankly crappy worksheet, which is wrong in terms of the language produced by a teacher, or in terms of a textbook which will go into hundreds of classrooms. If we're not talking about that, we're failing to sweat the small stuff. We're getting it wrong. Now I am going to write very, very shortly about the importance of getting policy right, but then doing the unsexy statescraft of implementation. So yes, I am worried that there will be head teachers who will proselytise about textbook without knowing what the implications are, and I think that's real danger in England, because we're not good at sweating the small stuff. So the second, and then the final point is this, that, and in a way that deals also, of course, with the question of, well, variability of teaching. Yeah, so you have to pay attention to how textbooks are used. My final point is this, that around the world I see all sorts of different processes of adoption. Yeah, in Texas, yep, loads of creationists on the textbook of approval panels, probably reflecting the number of creationists in Texan society. There's a bit of a challenge for us. Really crucial in what textbooks we should select and why. When we look at the textbooks in the highest performing systems that do extraordinary things in terms of equity, I mean, they do amazing things for kids irrespective of their social background. We find some extraordinary stuff. If I look at the textbooks in Shanghai, there are bits in there that relate to the way in which multiplication has been taught for over 2,000 years in that society. It's still in there because it's absolutely brilliant. And it gets all kids to an extraordinarily precocious level of understanding of mathematics compared to our children. There are also bits in there which are absolutely modern, based on lesson observation in the very best schools, brought up into the textbooks, and then made available to all teachers. And it's that kind of sweating the small stuff in terms of the content and the processes for getting it out to schools in a way that it's understood, which I think we're very bad at in England, and we've got to get much better at very quickly.
Thank you. Susie, and then Dave.
And just to follow up on that point, and the lady in the top right mentioned how many different lessons were given out of the same textbook, and the question whether there was a need for training on how to use resources. I think there's something of a crisis of professional development in this country generally. Lots of the structures that we had previously for delivering professional development are no longer present. Local authorities have had their funding slashed and kind of are fading out of the picture. We know that teacher training has become increasingly school-based and moved away from universities. Do we have a forum in the UK at the moment for delivering the kind of what you described really, Tim, the fact that different generations of teachers build on what the previous generation learnt and learn from what has worked and refine it and hone it into a technique and a pedagogy that really works well for teaching a particular subject? Do we have a way of delivering that type of training now to teachers in the country?
Okay, thank you. Dave.
Okay, just one thing on the kind of tablety IT discussion. I can't help myself. Scientific American published something very recently, might have been their latest issue, about the fact that if you want to take notes, use a pen, don't use a laptop, because it goes in much better if you use a pen. There's something about that technology. I'm sorry, you can do it all you like, it's easier with a pen, right? And just more importantly, the other way round, I've met, I was at a conference in China, whatever, I got lucky, and I was there with some Americans from California at a very prestigious school, who were saying basically in primary school, don't bother using a pen, we don't need to learn to write, we just use technology, don't we? And I was like, are you crazy? You actually don't teach them to write anymore? No. And this has now got a currency that is not just down to one or two mad people, but it is actually live, right? And so you've got to ask yourself a question about technology. We're sort of, opening the door to something. If we're not careful, we'll get run over by it. We need to be a little bit careful. Just another way of looking at it very quickly, if I can, because this is complicated, and it's making me think, this debate, so please don't think I'm just going in one direction. As I actually advocate technology a lot, but you won't get it from me today, bizarrely. But the thing is, and the point you made, when kids use technology, it's not the same as us using it. And I think it's not the same as us using it educationally either. And actually what they really need is direct instruction from a teacher to be able to understand something in the context of a lesson and a subject that you're teaching. With technology gets in the way. And they know it. Because they would much prefer to go to a teacher to find out how to explain something than they would to go to the internet, which is supposed to be, comes from Teach First, this little sort of meme. Put 3 kids in a laptop in a room and they can find out anything. No, they can't. Google doesn't teach. We do.
I'm actually from the United States. I teach in New York City in an inner city school. I've taught Spanish, world history, and now U.S. history in a blended classroom always. And it's something that one of you had mentioned, that the students, they've told me, I don't use this to write. I don't use technology to research and write essays. I use it to Snapchat and Instagram and everything. When I use it in the classroom, they're very engaged. But when I ask them to do an assignment at home, it barely gets done. And I know homework is always a struggle, but I'm wondering if it has something to do with the fact that when they're at home, it's their social time and not it's not work time. And I'm wondering if in the future, because technology is still kind of new being utilized in school, if in the future after kindergartners start like in pre-K and first grade, if they're always using technology, if they'll figure out, you know, now it's time to work and now it's playtime, like if that will eventually come about.
Just to echo what Dave was saying about how students use these resources, I'm a maths teacher, and we use the opportunity of the new GCSE to get a whole new set of textbooks, and it was very interesting because all the 30-year-old and younger teachers in my school are amazed that they have these books that they can use, and that they have questions that stretch the children, and that they're not constantly scrambling around for resources now, because they actually have a textbook that they can use and can teach from. What is interesting though was my school took the line, not that tablets and students don't mix, but that textbooks and students don't mix, and they wouldn't pay for one textbook for every child, because the children will take them home and they will destroy them and they won't last for the next year. So we have the interactive textbook for the students. They can use them in the school, but when they're home, they need to use the interactive version. Now, not one single member of staff uses that interactive version at home. They took a textbook home, because that's how we learn, that's how we reference, that's what we do. But that's not what we're asking our students to do. And actually, the interactive book is great. You know, it takes them to links to explain things and to extend things, but they don't use that. They come in and they ask us about it. And partly because I think there's a horrible irony in fashion of obsessing with skills, that we've robbed students of the ability of the skill to go away and research, because they've not had textbooks that they can do that with.
Cheers, thanks.
I completely agree with the idea that we need to trust great teachers to deploy their professional judgment to deliver the best education for students. But if I were a parent, I don't know if I'd trust the teachers to I don't know if I trust every teacher to deliver the best education. And if I believe that one teacher would give a different kind of education to another teacher, I would be very uncomfortable with that. So I wonder if we need to change the way that the way that parents trust teachers to actually enable them to use textbooks in the best way.
I'm a colleague of Harley's and Susie's at Discovery Education. A couple of observations. Tim, you referred a long time ago to budgets, to America saying get rid of paper. Don't know, but that could be something to do, my American colleagues tell me, with the budgets in states for adoption cycles and the margins that traditional publishers like to charge. Colin, the Kindle effect, women's commercial fiction, I think we know that as the 50 Shades of Grey effect. And that doesn't mean that Kindles and books, you know, are not going to be bought digitally in future. I think it took the audience to raise the question, what's the purpose of education? And I think that, I think, José, you said that engagement is a poor proxy for learning. I hear everywhere that there's a crisis of engagement in secondary schools. And I would say learning doesn't happen without engagement, and engagement starts with a good teacher. Not good resources, but without those resources, you won't take that engagement on. Dave, how's your 35-year-old textbooks chapter on the Large Hadron Collider? Okay. How is it on cosmological navigation? How would you lead the discussion in your school on the Zika virus and genetic modification without recourse to the internet and curated resources?
Hello. So when it comes to it's more efficient or easier to learn something if you take notes with a pen, or the impact of books on learning. There's various claims and studies on this, but I think, are we actually thinking about the idea of it, you know, the medium being the message in this case? So McLuhan's point, how does it apply to learning and technology nowadays? And also, when it comes to future generations and their relationship with technology, are we thinking about them? Shouldn't we be designing our teaching and our education by keeping in mind that babies know how to use tablets since day one?
I want to come back to something that was said in a previous round of questions, actually, which is, do we need textbooks for different subjects at different levels, i.e. do we always need textbooks? And I think in response to that, I'd say if we want to prevent teachers from having to reinvent the wheel, and as the student up there said, if we want to prevent students from having to have a passionate interest and having to do their own research in every subject, then I think we either need textbooks or we need curated resources of some sort. So yes, I think there is definitely a strong case to be made for resources in all subjects at all levels.
Funny one to end on, serendipity. It's a funny thing of this. I think that if you want to chance into knowledge that you don't know, how's the best way to do it? So most people think, well, you just go on the internet and Google or whatever. No, you can't, because you don't know what you're looking for. Actually, my favourite thing is still go in the bottom of a really good bookshop and just go through the lot. Yeah? One of them is ooh, what's that? Right? Or even read a textbook that's a really good textbook. I've no idea what this bit is, I've never read it before. I don't think at the moment technology allows you to do that.
My biggest worry, and the thing that I would want to part on, is what we should be anxious about here is not the business about quality textbooks and quality digital material. That is happening, I absolutely guarantee it. My worry is policy that will push us towards the lowest common denominator, as is very often the case in the education system. We need to be very careful not to let that happen. There is a real risk of that happening.
I'd simply like to reinstate my original point, which is that it's not about whether one is or should be better than the other. I think even here in the panel, there's been a little bit of a disagreement, which is probably a good thing. Particularly, the one thing I would disagree with is the fact that the examples that have been used, for example, to illustrate how technology doesn't work. So we still put technology in contrast, in opposition to teaching. So we think that technology, when we decry the use of technology, sometimes we say, well, actually, you put children in front of a computer, they're going to learn worse than in front of a teacher. Well, of course they are. My point with using technology is not that. My point is that when a teacher uses technology properly to teach the children, that's when they learn better. So I think we have to be very wary of polarising this debate.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Okay, so briefly, I think publishers are absolutely part of the solution and not part of the problem. And Colin knows that when I attacked the quality of textbooks and resources in this country, I was not attacking individuals or institutions. I was attacking the unfortunate set of circumstances which have been created in this country, which led publishers to respond to a demand which was not conditioned appropriately and demanded poor quality materials. And I think we're getting out of that now. I think it's extraordinary, the journey that we've made in such a short period of time. But publishers have a fantastic range of functions, and I think they need to be supported in an appropriate way by the policy machinery. I want to end really on the reality of what happens in the classroom. I held up a worksheet, and I see them time and time and time again. I think we actually bog down the highest quality teachers in expectations around the fact that they should create those things. And then actually, by the absence and the poor quality of the materials that have been available previously, we've actually prevented good teachers from doing their job, not enabled them to do a good job. And I think that the insights from history and from good systems around the world as we sit here is that the highest quality materials can support the highest quality teaching. And I think the research points unequivocally to that.
Okay, thanks. Let's please big it up for our panellists.